Hey everybody, I'm Dan Gregerson. I'm a mental health counselor, and this is the second video in a series that's talking about deep breathing. And today we get to talk about why it's useful in terms of all of the changes that happen in the brain when we're doing deep breathing. And I'll also go into how deep breathing becomes meditation. So in order to talk about the brain, I'm going to use my fist as a model. And right where my fingers are is the prefrontal cortex. That's right behind our forehead, where we do our higher reasoning, like making plans for the future and thinking about the consequences of my actions. And where my thumb is tucked in is called the amygdala, and that's the survival part of the brain that does that fight or flight stuff. And they've done research that shows that this part, the amygdala, fires first before the prefrontal cortex does. Now that's kind of weird to think about different parts of your brain working differently, but it makes sense if I put it in a survival context. If I'm out in the woods hunting and I'm being stalked by a cougar and I see it just as it pounces, I need to move instantly to have any chance of survival. I can't take time to think, should I try to dodge it or swing the gun around, and I can't remember if the safety's on, and by then it's too late. And you've experienced this anytime you come home and a family member jumps out from behind a door and says, boo, right? Your first response is like this, and then your prefrontal cortex kicks in and recognizes them and tells you, this is not a threat, calm down. But you don't calm down right away, right? It takes about 25 or 30 minutes for your heart to get back to normal while you're busy telling them how much trouble they're in for scaring the crap out of you. Now, part of that is the amount of time it takes the body to process that shot of adrenaline, but it's also true that these two parts of the brain don't communicate very well with each other. Now, that's weird to think about too, but the reason is that they work on different principles. So the prefrontal cortex works on logic. It takes logic point A, logic point B, puts them together and comes to a conclusion. The amygdala does not understand logic. It only learns by experience. So if I experience a situation that was dangerous or threatening in some way, and then later on I experience another situation that's similar to this one, even if it's a really vague similarity like a smell or a sound, my survival brain is going to err on the side of caution and treat this one as if it were an equally threatening situation as the original one was, and it only has one possible response, which is the shot of adrenaline. Now that causes my heart to race and the breathing to speed up. Does that sound familiar? If you've had panic attacks, you know that's what a panic attack is. There's never been a panic attack that wasn't triggered by the amygdala that perceived a threat of some kind. Now, when I say that to people who have chronic panic attacks, they say that's not true. I get panic attacks out of nowhere. Sometimes I wake up with a panic attack. So where's the trigger? Well, what happens is there is a trigger, a possible threat, but a lot of times it is so subtle that my prefrontal cortex doesn't notice it. And so I think that there was no trigger, but my amygdala, my survival brain, does notice it because that's its job to keep me alive. And it has its response, which is that shot of adrenaline, which causes the heart to race and the breathing to speed up. And another thing that happens is a lot of the blood leaves the brain and goes to the major organs, especially the heart and lungs. And that makes sense because that's what I need to either fight the big scary thing or run away from it. So that helps me with a physical threat situation, but it doesn't help me with a psychological threat, which is what we face more in life these days, right? It's like, how am I going to pay my bills? And if I have pain, what's my pain going to do to me 5 years from now? Those kind of psychological threats. Unfortunately, the amygdala doesn't understand that distinction either. It just says threat is threat, and here's what you need to survive it. And it starts pumping out that adrenaline, and then I feel anxious. So let's put this in a little more concrete scenario. Let's say I go to the grocery store one night to do a little shopping, and as I'm checking out, it gets robbed at gunpoint. And the thief points his gun in my face, so it's a life-threatening situation. Every time I go to the grocery store after that, I'm going to feel anxious. Even though my prefrontal cortex says that was a random freak event, it'll never happen again. Hundreds of people go to that grocery store every day and they're just fine, so it's a safe place. My amygdala says it wasn't always a safe place. There was one time it was life-threatening, and therefore it must be a dangerous place. That situation is a good example of the interplay between these two parts of the brain, because on the one hand, the prefrontal cortex takes precedence, so I can make myself go to the scary place. But on the other hand, I can't just tell myself to calm down and actually calm down, right? So that's the bad news, is the poor communication between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Now the good news is that we can use our bodies to communicate with the amygdala, and that's one of the benefits of the deep breathing. It's impossible to do both at the same time. You can't be breathing slowly and calmly and stay at high alert with everything else. The slow, deliberate breathing through the nose is the way to communicate to the amygdala that this is not a threat situation and I don't need you to keep pumping out this adrenaline in order for me to survive it. Now, the challenge, as you may know if you have anxiety, is to continue breathing slowly and calmly when you are starting to get stirred up into a panic attack. And that's why the practice is so important. You know, if you hear about this neat deep breathing technique and you think, oh, I'll try that next time I have a panic attack, and that's a month or 2 months down the road, and then you try it, it probably isn't going to be very effective for you. In fact, you might end up just hyperventilating. But if you practice so that this gets to be like second nature to you, then you can use it in a crisis situation when you really need it. Now, another thing that happens when we do deep breathing, it triggers the brain to release endorphins. And you probably know already, endorphins are those positive brain chemicals that you get from exercising or eating chocolate. Now, endorphins do two things for us. The first thing is the one everybody knows about, which is the sense of euphoria. So people call it the runner's high, that feeling of peacefulness and calm that comes over you. And that's an almost instantaneous benefit. Even just doing a few deep breaths, the brain starts kicking out those endorphins, and that helps us deal with a stressful situation in the moment. The other thing that endorphins do is, you know what it's like when you have a little more significant injury, like a deep cut or a broken bone, that you're numb for a little bit in the beginning, right? It's only after about 20 or 30 minutes that the pain really kicks in. I always think of that as my window of opportunity to get to the urgent care and get it numbed up before the pain really kicks in. Well, the reason that you're numb is because the brain is flooded with endorphins. So endorphins also have the power to anesthetize pain. In fact, they fit the same receptors in our brain that opiates do. The word endorphin is actually a contraction for endogenous morphine. So endorphins are our body's natural painkillers, and that's one of the ways that this deep breathing helps with chronic pain. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that happens when we have a panic attack is that the blood leaves the brain and goes to the major organs. Now, that does two things to us. The first thing is that the function of blood is to carry oxygen to the organs, including the brain. So with less blood in the brain, that means there's less oxygen in the brain. And you know what it feels like when you hold your breath. When you get towards the end of how long you can hold your breath, your brain starts going all sparkly with those panic messages saying, I need oxygen up here. But if I'm getting stirred up in a panic attack and then I get that I need oxygen message, I don't distinguish one panic from the other. I just feel more panicked. And that's one of the ways that panic attacks build on themselves. But the second thing is that oxygen in the brain is the fuel in the vehicle. That's what our brains work on. So with less oxygen in the brain, my brain isn't working very well. And so what you hear about often is people who have chronic panic attacks go to their cardiologist. They get thoroughly checked out and their heart's just fine, but the next panic attack, they're certain this really is the big one, get me to the ER, because they're not thinking very clearly about that situation. So the deep breathing helps with both of those things, because once I do some deep breathing, and part of the importance of breathing in through the nose is it helps redirect the blood back to the brain, so that panicked I need oxygen message goes away almost immediately. And after I've taken enough time to do 4 or 5 or 6 deep breaths, I get enough oxygen back in the brain that I'm able to think more clearly about the situation and recognize this is not a threat, I'm fine, it's just a panic attack, and if I do my deep breathing, I'll be just fine. So what's the connection between deep breathing and meditation? Well, it's always Chapter 1 of every book on meditation is about learning how to breathe properly, and what that means is breathing as slowly as you can and breathing into the belly. But there's another part of it that is just as important, and that is working at trying to keep your focus just on your breathing and not allowing the brain to be distracted by other thoughts. But there's a problem with that, which is that our brains are hardwired to be distracted. And so if you think about this, this is another one of those survival mechanisms. So if you imagine a deer in the woods and how it behaves, right? It's much, look around, much. So the deer's brain is constantly looking around for two things: food sources and threats. Now our brains are like that, only way more complex. So for us, it's more like channel surfing. I'm thinking about my to-do list after I leave here, and that song I heard on the radio on the way here, and that person I was dating in high school when that song was popular, and that just boom, 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 it's constantly moving around. So it doesn't work very well to try to shut that off and tell myself, just don't be distracted, because I'm always going to be distracted. That's how my brain is wired. So it's better to try to make it a cycle. At some point, I have the awareness that I'm thinking about my to-do list instead of my breathing, and when that happens, I want to just release the distraction and go back to focus on my breathing. And if it's fine if I have to go around this cycle every 3 or 4 seconds in the beginning. It doesn't matter how many times I go around, as long as I keep coming back to focusing on my breathing, eventually I get better at staying there longer. But it's important to say that I can practice this my whole life, and I'm still going to get distracted sometimes because that's the brain wiring. But where people get derailed is right here, when I have the awareness that I'm thinking about my to-do list again instead of my breathing. They go off into a type of self-judgment, saying things like, maybe this works for other people, but it's not going to work for me because my brain is just too active, and what a loser I am that I can't even keep my thoughts on my breath for 4 lousy breaths. And then they give up, rather than seeing that that self-judgment is just another distraction, and I can let go of that too and go back to focus on my breathing. And I like to play a little joke with myself and say, I'll judge myself later, right now I'm breathing. Now, with that in mind, this is another place where this plugs into chronic pain, because probably everybody with chronic pain has experienced some times where they were really focused on a good movie or a book they were reading or a really interesting conversation, and they forgot about their pain. It didn't get any less, it didn't go away, but they just weren't focused on it because they were so focused on the other thing. And anytime that happens, it's a blessing, it's a little mini vacation from the pain. And so I can think of the pain as just another distraction. And I kind of like to play a similar joke and imagine that the pain is like a little child that paradoxically I can trust is not going to wander off because I'm not watching it. So it's okay for me to set it aside and just focus on my breathing. And like a little kid, it's going to nag at me and try to get my attention when I'm trying to focus on the meditation. And when that happens, again, paradoxically, I can say, yes, thank you, pain, for reminding me that you're there. Now I'm going to go back to my breathing. It's a bit of a pet peeve of mine that in our society, people seem to have this false understanding about meditation, that it's somehow about emptying their minds and not having any thoughts. And so they try meditation and they don't accomplish that. And so they think they failed and they can't do it and they quit. But really, it's not possible to have no thoughts because, again, our brains are hardwired to be distracted. So what it really is about is not emptying the mind. It's about learning how to control the focus of my attention. And if I practice this a lot, then I can put my attention on my breathing and not be on things that I don't want it to be, like pain or anxiety-provoking thoughts, right? So it's really all about learning to control the focus of your attention. Okay guys, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. And in the next video, I will talk about another aspect of the deep breathing and meditation, and it's potentially the most important one. It's called neuroplasticity. So check that one out next.